So this section is about the ownership structure of the project. Who owns the assets and who gets the money or a particular part of the money that comes from the asset investment. So we have three different options. The first option is to be client owned, so that means that there's no investor ownership. It's owned by the project, I suppose the project lead or the business that's setting this up. We then have the investor owned, which basically means that an external investor will buy the assets to be installed, and then the tariff savings from those that accrue from those investments will be shared between the investor and the client. And then we have the final one, which is a power purchase agreement, a PPA, which is where again an investor will buy the asset, and then they will charge the site owner a price for every kilowatt hour that's being used from that asset. So I'm just going to go into a bit more detail about those three so that you can sort of understand them. Okay, so we're going to start with the client owned with no external investor. So effectively we've got our end client up here, and they have their sort of demand, whether it's electric for power and for heat, and possibly also for transport. So that site owner, that end client, will pay for all of the existing grid import at the start. Okay, we then bring in these new assets, so generation and/or energy storage, and in this case, the site owner will pay for those new assets. Okay, those new assets will then create, we hope, a reduction in grid import costs. And possibly some export income as well. So the site owner in this case receives all of the benefits of the lower grid import and any export that's sent back to the grid, and possibly also any income from a feed-in tariff if there is one available. So we then move on to the second one. So this one is where we have the investor-owned shared savings. So in this case we have an end client, and again they have their site and transport, and they're paying for the grid import at the start before the project takes place. We then have an investor who puts money in to pay for these new generation and/or energy storage assets. Those assets, just like before, will create tariff savings by reducing grid import costs, and effectively from those grid import cost reductions or tariff savings, we will get then a split of those savings between the investor and the client, and those will be determined by other inputs in GridMAP. So X% of the savings might be 80, might be 60, might be 70, who knows, will go to the investor to repay their investment in those generation and/or storage assets, and the residual will go to the end client. We then have the third type, which is a power purchase agreement. Now again, in this case, we have the end client who has their site that is currently paying for grid import costs through an energy or electricity tariff. So again, we get the investor, they pay for those new assets, those storage or generation assets, and again, those storage or generation assets will reduce the grid import costs of the end client. Now in this case, what happens is we get flows from that going back to the investor and the end client, but they're slightly different. For the end client, they're going to receive all of the grid import reduction benefits, whereas the investor will receive money for every kilowatt hour for every unit that's used on site, and that's the power purchase agreement. And the investor may also share in the, not share, but actually receive any benefits from export income or other kind of income benefits that they may accrue for the assets in external markets. So that is an overview of the three different types that we can do in GridMAP. So within the project, you just need to choose one of those, and depending on whichever one you choose, you'll have some further questions with regards to, well, if it's shared savings, how much the investor will receive, and if it's a power purchase agreement, what cost per kilowatt hour they're going to be charging. Hopefully that's of use. Thanks for listening.